Welcome to Conversations of Hope, shining light on the journey of healing from abuse and trauma. I'm Faith Ingraham of Speaking Truth in Love Ministries.
And I'm Michelle Viscuse from Journey Pink. As survivors and advocates, we're here to support, educate, and inspire. Whether you're a survivor of abuse, a friend, family member, or a professional working with survivors, this podcast is for you.
We're breaking the silence that allows abuse to thrive, offering insights for healing and tools for effective support.
Our goal is to create a safe community of understanding, healing, and hope for survivors and their allies.
Visit conversationsofhopepodcast.org for resources and more information. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Welcome to Conversations of Hope. Today we have a guest whose journey personifies resilience, growth, and the power of reclaiming one's narrative. Please join us in welcoming Sarah Carr. Sarah is a certified financial planner with over 2 decades of experience, and she recently earned her certification as a certified financial therapist. In her practice, she integrates financial therapy to help her clients cultivate overall financial well-being. Sarah's expertise isn't just professional, it's deeply personal. Her own journey of growth and healing has led her to become a powerful advocate for those who have been harmed in religious and spiritual contexts. She currently serves on the board as chair for the Relocation Collective, a national community advocacy organization. Sarah's story is one of transformation, challenging long-held beliefs and finding the courage to speak out. Today, she's here to share her experiences and insights with us. Sarah, thank you for joining us today. We're honored to have you here to share your story and insights with us.
Thank you, Faith. Thank you, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for all that you do in amplifying voices and shining lights in these places that are hard and difficult places to sit in.
So, Sarah, can you just share your story with our listeners?
Yeah. So let me take you back to provide some context. I grew up in a family of 6. I had one of 4 and 2 parents. My dad was a pastor, an evangelical, non-denominational, very small community though. Like our church family was super small, mostly family, mostly community members. There was some aspects of fundamental evangelical culture, a little Methodist, Assemblies of God kind of flavor thrown in there. And that was my childhood experience, was family and church and, just living. If anyone has ever been a pastor's child knows what that church life is like. And when I probably around 12, 13 years old was when there was some movement towards more of the charismatic movement with, I think it was Rodney Howard-Browne down in Lakeland, Florida, Vineyards, and some very much more than I had ever been exposed to as far as like some crazy, what I consider now to be a little bit crazy with like the blessings and people rolling around laughing and just different movements in the charismatic realm. And my parents were drawn to that. And so my dad ended up closing down his small church and had felt called to move to Lakeland, Florida to be part of Carpenter's home church there. And it was an incredible experience. We ended up going down. He was down there a little bit before my family joined him. And the hope was that we could relocate and live down in Lakeland. But after summer, our house here in Pennsylvania, I'm from Pennsylvania area, did not sell. So we had to move back in order to start school in the fall. Prior to when my dad had kind of closed down his church, there was another church that my aunt and uncle had attended. And some of the people that had attended our family church ended up going there. So when we came back from Lakeland, Florida, that's where we ended up going. And I had known some of the people in this church, mostly youth group, because when you're in a small family church, there's not a lot of other peers. There's not a lot of other youth. So this youth group was really a lot of fun. There was a lot more people involved. And for once, they weren't family members. So it was a really fun experience to be part of this youth group. Well, when we came back from Florida, I noticed that the youth pastor at the time was spending a lot more time with the former youth leaders of my dad's church, was spending more time with my family out where we lived, was spending all of his vacation days in that realm and nearby, whether it was the house just down the street from us, which is where one of the other youth leaders had been living. And then eventually he was coming up to my parents' house on a regular basis. Every Monday, it seemed like he was stopping by and spending time at our family's house. The youth pastor was a very magnetic personality, lots of fun, always playing around with all the kids. And I was in that circle of kids. And I noticed that there were a couple moments that were just interesting. Now, certainly 2020 vision, you kind of look back and you're like, oh, wow, that was something. But there was one incident where I remember we were just in a group of people and I got up and I went and got him a glass of water and I handed it to him. And he said to me, he goes, you would make, or I mean, he might have actually said it to one of the other people there, you would make a really excellent wife. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm at the time 14 years old. But as time went on and months passed, he continued to stay. And this was, if to give some culture, this was in the mid 90s. So there was a lot of culture around courtship and betrothals and not dating until God revealed who your spouse was supposed to be. The culture that I grew up in was very much about this aspect that God had this perfect will, this perfect plan laid out for you. And we're supposed to walk it, right? And certainly when it came to relationships and marriage, there was a hope that God had one. We prayed for our spouses. It was during that purity culture, purity rings, and making sure you reserve yourself, not even just sex before marriage, but kissing. And the whole thing was meant to be come up with your boundaries and don't cross those boundaries and reserve that for marriage. And there was a lot of effort put around that. There was a lot of effort on not dating. I was not allowed to date, which at the time, I mean, who was I going to date? But I remember even having crushes and being like, oh, I want to date that person. And my parents would be like, you're too young. That's not anything that we're doing. Just hang out with friends in groups kind of thing. And I had a dream where this pastor had been proposing to me, this youth pastor. He was also the worship leader of our church and also what they would consider to be a prophet. This church was very involved with prophetic words and prophetic gifting, and everyone can prophesy. And you looked for God to reveal his plans to you. And I remember having this dream. Again, I would now think of this dream much differently, but I didn't tell anyone initially about this dream. I just had written it down in my journal and kind of was like, oh my God, that's crazy, and walked away from it. But I had heard my mom and this pastor talking about some things, and I was keyed in on what they were saying. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think they're talking about us getting married or something like that. So I confronted them on that. And I said, hey, I think I know what you're talking about. They're like, no. Anyway, he had approached my parents and said that he had had a word from God that I was meant to be his wife. And so then it was, let's take this to the church leaders. This is, God revealing his will. We do believe that you are meant to be his wife. We believe in the prophetic gifting, and this would be amazing. I don't know all of what had happened because I was a child, like I was 14 years old. So I wasn't invited to any of the church leadership conversations. I know that they happened. I know the pastors of the church were aware of the relationship. They initially blessed the relationship and it was public. It was like, we went public with this is what God's revealed. This is now a betrothal and a courtship. I was not allowed to date, so we were not allowed to go out. He was also 26 at the time. So there was a considerable age difference as well. Other than one pastor at Morning Star. So our church was part of Morning Star Ministries, and the leadership of Morning Star Ministries was also aware of the relationship. I know that there had been conversation about that. One of the leaders there had called me personally and said, hey, I'm just concerned about you being so young. And he'd expressed that. I honestly remember thinking to myself, I don't know what you want me to do with that information, because I'm thinking to myself, I am the one that doesn't have power. Because at that point in time, by the time I'd gotten that phone call, I had already tried to get out of the relationship twice. I had already tried to say that I wasn't comfortable. My mom at one point had said, I'd gone to her and said, I don't feel comfortable with this relationship. I don't want this. And my mom was like, cool, no problem. We'll get you out of this. I don't know who she spoke with. I went and spoke to some people. But before she even got back to me, this pastor had heard this and gotten a hold of me and had already started in with, this is just an attack of the enemy. This is Satan throwing some fear and is filling your head with worry and doubts. And are you not strong enough to fulfill God's will? And don't you want God's will for your life? And my God, there's nothing more at that time than I wanted to fulfill God's purpose for my life. I really wanted to do what God wanted me to do. And so if this was it, then I was like, yes, okay, I do want to do what God wants. And if that means this relationship, then okay, then yes, I will submit to God's will here. And so at that point, I really felt like this is what God was telling me to do. So I'm going to fulfill it. I didn't have any other choice. And, everything I had known about following God's will, the Christian culture that I grew up in gave you that message that following God is hard, that you have to lay down your life, that you have to sacrifice, that you have to lay down your own wishes, your own will in order to follow God. Many are called, but few are chosen. All of these scriptures were then used, right, to help verify and validate that this is really what God's asking me to do. The relationship evolved. I spent time with him at my parents' house. I spent time with him at his house. Like I said, we weren't allowed to actually go out without parents being with us. But I was allowed time with him in one of my dad's office, or if we were allowed to go for walks, we had some alone time. And at one point, I remember that there was I don't know if some of the church members or there were some aspects where I was told you really shouldn't be talking about this relationship. There was an incident with a youth group and a big youth event that had happened, and some of the girls stayed in my room, and I had roses. My whole room was filled with roses because he would buy me like half a dozen roses every week, I felt like, initially in the relationship. And they were all drying. So I was telling them a story about how God revealed that I'm going to marry this youth pastor. And they're my age. They're like, 14 years old at the time, 15. And they're like, oh, that's so exciting. They ended up going and telling their youth pastors and their leaders that were with them. And they left the conference. And I got approached and asked, what did I say? And I said, well, I just told the story. And the pastor's wife at the time was the one who approached me. And she said, Sarah, you can't, people are not always going to understand the relationship. And you need to be careful of who you talk to about it because good people will get hurt. So I learned very quickly, okay, this is God saying that this is okay. My leadership is telling me that it's okay, but I need to be careful about who I talk to about this relationship because people won't understand God. People won't understand God's will. And I think things might have heated up a little bit. I don't know the circumstances, but the pastor who I was engaged to, betrothed to, left that church to go be part of another ministry. And it was a traveling ministry. A family friend of his had a traveling ministry where they went and preached in different locations. And so he left the church to do that. Thinking back, I think there might have been more to that story. I just don't know what those details are as to why. But what it did was it cut me off from the youth group. So I stopped going to youth group and I stopped going to church because I really only went with him whenever he sometimes was local enough to where I would go be with him when he was preaching. So pretty much I was on my own just with family. Whoever came to my house. It wasn't long before he had suggested that I leave school. So I was in ninth grade, but there was a small incident in ninth grade where something had happened with another student, and this pastor had approached my parents and said, I think that for Sarah's benefit, you should probably take her out and homeschool her for her safety. And so my parents were on board with that. I'd been homeschooled once before, so I didn't mind too much. And at this point, it felt weird as well to be with my peers who I couldn't really talk to about this relationship anyway. They wouldn't understand. And I just felt different. I didn't feel like I fit in at this point anymore anyway, because here my whole life is planned ahead of me. I'm not looking at colleges. I'm going to go get married. And so I wasn't allowed to participate in anything with that group of friends anyway. So I was homeschooled, and really just life was do my homeschooling, which I finished a year and a half early. I finished when I was 16. And I just hung out with my family and him. And it was really isolated for those years. And really the whole plan was for me to just get married, wait to that moment of where I could get married. At 17, I literally turned 17 and my parents and I went down to the courthouse and signed off on the paperwork for the marriage license. And a wedding was planned for days after I turned 17, like within a week or so. And I will say, I did not enjoy wedding planning. I did not enjoy dress shopping. It felt very awkward because I know that I looked young. And I just remember thinking to myself that all of these people that I'm in these wedding dress shops are looking at me and thinking, what the hell is happening here? Why is she getting married? And just those questions. And it's just, I felt a lot of shame still around at all of that. And it was very uncomfortable. But we planned a wedding and a wedding was scheduled. I had one best friend from Lakeland, Florida that I still talk to on the phone. And she came up for the wedding and we were ready to do it. And he got sick with pancreatitis and ended up in the emergency room and admitted to the hospital. And the wedding had to be postponed. And month of hospital stays ensued. And we ended up in Syracuse at a hospital up there. And there was one incident. And I remember I looked petite and little and young, and he looked older and much more mature and much bigger in stature. And I know that it looked odd. You could just, when people looked at us and were like, what is going on? What is, this couple situation? It just looks weird. And I could feel all of that. I was not oblivious to that feeling at all. And the hospital was no different. I felt that. But there was an altercation between his parents and I, his mom in particular. It was, I thought, a rather simple conversation around diet. And she got mad at me and she shoved me down to the ground. And a nurse walking by happened to see it. And she came in immediately and she took me out of the room. We went for a walk and we sat down on a park bench outside. And she's just simply said, I don't know what's going on. You don't have to do anything that you don't want to. Just need you to know that you have your whole life ahead of you and you have choices. And she just sat with me and we breathed. And I went back inside and I called my parents and I said, I need you to come back up to get me. I need to come home for a little while. And so they did. From that moment on, I had lost contact with this man. And he and his family invoked HIPAA. I was no longer able to call and check in. At that point in time, there was no cell phones, really. It was all landline. So they really cut off all communication. Eventually, after discharge from the hospital, he called me to inform me that while he was at the hospital, an angel of the Lord had appeared to him and told him that we were no longer meant to be married, that the engagement was being called off and that I would ruin his ministry. And then he cut off all contact for the most part. He came and got the things that had moved into the house that we were going to move into. And I think I met with him one other time just to try to get some closure. And there was really nothing that he said. I asked if he had loved me. He said he did at one point, not now. And I just needed to move on with my life, burn everything I ever gave you, get rid of it, just move on with your life kind of thing. And I was really crushed because at this point, I had no other thoughts or ideas like of what to do with life. And here I am thinking that God had told me that this was my purpose and my destiny. And God's changing his mind. And underlyingly, I'm thinking it's because it's me. I'm unworthy. I failed. And I had known what had happened between us. And I understood like there's aspects of the sexual activity that happened between us, although I had never allowed it to go to the point of full-on sexual intercourse. Pretty much everything else had happened during that relationship period, almost from the get-go. And so for me, I had held that secret thinking that I failed, right? It was my job to maintain these boundaries and to not allow what happened to us, regardless of what he had told me, and which he had told me, in God's eyes, we're already married. This is okay, all that stuff. Yet I still carried that guilt, that shame of I knew what we were doing was wrong. And then by the time that this relationship had ended, the whole time I'm thinking, oh my God, like I've done the ultimate sin. God's never going to forgive me. I still hustled for my worthiness, though. I will say I still tried. I was still all about trying to win God's favor back. And I jumped back into the youth group after that relationship ended, it was just such an incredible experience to be part of my peers again. And I just moved on with life as best I could. I eventually got married, divorced, life events happened. And then I think it was 2019. I had, at that point in time in life, through different life events, I had done a lot of healing and I had done a lot of work on shame. And this event that had happened in my life that I really just wanted to distance myself from as much as possible. Pretty much anybody that knew me during that time knew of that, the engagement, that betrothal, but anybody else that I had ever met, I never talked about. I was just like, just wipe it, just keep it in the past. Don't even mention it. There usually wasn't a reason to, but it all resurfaced as I'm hearing other people's stories, as I'm doing the work around shame. And in particular, I saw a documentary with Jan Borgen's story, Abducted in Plain Sight. That was a Netflix special at the time. And I noticed all of these pieces of grooming behavior. And even though her story is very different from mine, there were so many similar themes that I was like, oh my God, this is my story. This is what happened to me. This is the same thing. And this man is a complete predator. And at the end, it had gone on to say that the person that had abused her in her story had continued, even though he was a married man, even though he was an upstanding man in the community, had continued to go on and abuse others. And that was alarming to me. I remember calling my sister and being like, I can't live with myself. What if during this entire time that I've been silent, be thinking that it was just me, he's gone on and abused other people? Like, I just can't live with that thought. I've got to do something now. And so that's what really urged me to come forward. And just a whole experience in and of itself. I went forward to the state police and because we were in two different states, we live right on the border, New York State and Pennsylvania, I ended up having to report to both states, state police, and I looked into different advocacy groups. And I will say I made the mistake of not getting an advocate before reporting. And I wish that I had had someone with me when I went and reported initially, but lessons learned. I went through that reporting process. I also reported to my parents. That was a tough conversation to let them know what had really happened. I reported to some of my peers, which I will say was really incredibly difficult. Their response, so the people that I went to youth group with, was, oh my God, I knew it. Like, I knew that something was wrong. That relationship felt wrong right from the very beginning. There was a lot of feeling a sense of responsibility. I remember telling my older brother, and he had that same experience. I was really concerned about telling him because he carried a lot of, I was supposed to protect you. And he had always hated that relationship, even from the beginning, and was never comfortable with it and felt like it had been off. So all of my youth, my peers had that similar experience of, we knew this was happening. We couldn't say anything. And we were right. We were proven right that this was a horrible experience. And we were so sorry for what you went through. And they've been incredible advocates since then. Walking through with my parents was a little bit more difficult, but they've been amazing. And then reporting to the church. I had come forward to the church in hopes that they would, one, acknowledge what happened to me, acknowledge their part, and maybe help fill in some questions that I still had, help me understand what had happened. And I'd really hoped that they would cooperate with the police investigation, but they did not. And as of this recording, other than one email apology of saying that they were sorry for my abuse, I have not heard from them, and they have not acknowledged, have not taken any action necessarily to right what was wrong, and certainly haven't made any steps for the police investigation either. So, but fast forward, I still moved forward with the case, and thankfully the state of Pennsylvania was adamant that there's crimes committed, and they were vigilant in completing their investigation and filing charges. What I didn't mention earlier was that after the relationship ended, this pastor had left the country. He was an only child. So I always find it interesting that he managed to up his entire livelihood here in the United States within a year after ending the relationship with me and moving to Australia. And he had lived there ever since. And so extradition had to be sought in order to arrest him. And that process took a while. But as of April this year, he had been trying to enter the Philippines when they stopped him because of the Interpol notice and handed him over to U.S. custody. And then he was brought back to my hometown where he was arraigned. And I faced him for the first time in 20 some years at the preliminary trial. And we are now facing the criminal trial, which is scheduled to happen sometime this fall. So that's where we stand.
Wow. Wow, that's a lot. Sarah, I first of all want to say that I am very sorry for what you went through and just not feeling supported by the people that were supposed to be there to protect you. The church, you were isolated right from the very beginning and told that your feelings were not valid because what other people thought God's will for you is what God's will is, and you have no say. And you aren't supposed to listen to your heart or your gut feelings or any of that. And it had to be horrific what you went through.
Yeah, and to miss the opportunity to be a teenager, to be with friends, to do things that teenagers do and go places that teenagers go. I am so sorry.
Thank
That's so
you.
hard.
Yeah. Yeah. That piece is hard to have missed those fundamental years of childhood experience, of proms and high school events and just being with your peers and dating and just all of that got taken from me.
Conversations of Hope extends beyond this podcast. Michelle and I are available to speak at women's, youth, church, and community events.
We offer presentations on abuse prevention, healing, and empowerment.
To learn more about our speaking engagements and personal coaching and support services, visit our website, conversationsofhopepodcast.org.
Together, we can inspire change and promote healing in your community.
Even what I've read about courtship, it's two adults that decide that's the way that they're going to have their relationship. It's not an adult and a child. And in your case, you had no say. You were a child and everybody else was making the decision that this is what you're going to do. And even in the Bible, when Abraham sends his servant to find a bride for Isaac, her father said, if she decides that she wants to go, she can go. It wasn't the adult making the decision for her even then. And so there really isn't a biblical basis at all for what happened to you. It was people saying, I know what God's will is for you based on this guy's feelings, and your feelings don't matter.
Yeah.
And that's horrific. There's no other way to put it, but it's abusive on so many levels, spiritually, emotionally, everything. You had no voice. And when you tried to use your voice, it was shut down.
Yeah. It's funny to me that you both can so clearly see that, right? Like you can see how wrong that was. And yet it's a very interesting experience for me because other than my parents, right, that have been part of this for me and my peers, like there's been none of those other adults that were there and present and confirming this or upholding this. There's been no other adult that has said, hey, like that is wrong. That's wrong on so many levels. And I just don't understand. There's part of me that's still very much, you're catching me at this phase in my journey of trying to wrap my head around how that's excused, how that's not seen. Is it not seen at all? Is it just justified? I just don't understand. I want someone to explain to me what their logic is, what the thinking is behind that.
Right. Well, there is no logic. That's why it's so hard to understand, because there is no logic being used.
Well, and it's funny too, when I reported, the Pennsylvania State Attorney General's office is the one that ended up taking over my case. They have a special task force of clergy abuse, or did at the time, and it's kind of part of that. When the attorney came in after he had reviewed the case notes, and he comes right in, my first meeting with him, and he goes, Sarah, I'm here to tell you that so many people failed you. This was not your fault. And so many people should have been there for you, should have raised questions. They failed you. And that was the first time I had someone in authority that validated that and said that. Right. And it hit. one of the biggest questions I have, and I'm interested in answering, not just for my own benefit, but what is it? You took an entire church community, and my family is pretty large, right? I have lots of aunts and uncles. And then you have a broader community that was aware of this relationship. Why weren't the alarm bells going off? What was it? Or if the alarm bells were going off, what silenced it? What was it that was part of that dynamic within that culture, within that community that said, hey, you're seeing something that is blatantly wrong, but you don't get to speak out against it?
Yeah. Yeah. You do wonder. And when you had voiced your concern and said you didn't want to go on with this, and your mom was shut down when
Yeah.
she went to whoever she went to, and you wonder if there were people that were raising alarm bells and they were being shut down as well.
Yeah.
We can't question
Right.
God's will. And so they were shutting them down because when you shared with the youth group, the girls, then that was also shut down. So people were raising alarm bells.
Yeah.
But the people that were promoting this whole relationship weren't listening to anybody that was raising the alarm bells. They
Yeah.
just had their agenda and we're going to just go through with it, which is very concerning that when people do raise alarm bells or question and it's shut down, you wonder what are the motives
Yeah.
behind
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you think about, I think as a survivor, when you speak out, one of the biggest things, the reason, because it's hard, right? You all know it's so hard sometimes to share and be vulnerable. But one of the biggest motivators is creating change, right? Is saying, hey, let's shine the light. Let's create safer environments. And so that remains for me one of those questions of how do we address this? How do we make sure this doesn't happen? How do we, and, and while my situation might have been extreme, right? There's a pretty significant age difference there. I know that there are other things that happen within churches, right? And within that culture that says that that's wrong and people recognize it. But then when they go to share with their leadership or go to share and raise a flag and say, hey, we need to pay attention to this, it's not addressed. I'm super curious, like, how can we create safer environments? How can we empower other people, congregants and people that are part of the community to have a voice in these places?
Right. And I think, like you said, we need to listen to victims and survivors. A lot of times churches re-victimize victims.
Yes.
And they minimize what they've gone through and they over spiritualize stuff. And this was God's will for your life. He's going to grow you through this and this will make you stronger. All of those things. And they don't address the fact that it was wrong. Yes, God can bring good out of bad things, but it's not God's will for people to sin against us.
Can we say that one more time louder? Because
I've been told this was God's will for you, and it's not. God's will is not for people to sin against each other.
Right.
And he can bring good out of it, but it's not his plan. He can do things in spite of it.
Yes.
And I am so grateful that that intervention of your betrothed getting sick prevented you from getting married because that would have been horrific. You had been with that man for any amount of time as a married couple because the abuse was already being done before you were married. And I'm thankful that you were able to get out from that situation.
Yeah. And thank you for the nurse that
I know.
intervened and took the
If I
time
could
to
ever
sit
find
beside
her.
you and sat
It
with
was-
you.
It was the perfect words that she somehow managed to find in that moment of just, you have options, you have choice.
Right.
Yeah. And I think too, when you're in that situation and you don't have a voice and people, they're seeing it, but they don't believe there's the grooming that this man had groomed the church community. He had groomed your parents.
Yep.
He had groomed the people in youth group to look at this as this is okay, even though it doesn't look okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Master
Wholehearted.
manipulator.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And it's funny to me too, because I think after he left, after the engagement ended and he left the area, it strikes me that no one asked questions afterwards. And I spent a lot of time with the pastor's family. A lot of time was there in their house pretty often. And not once did someone step in and ask the question, like, hey, did anything happen? Now that he's gone, he's out, the relationship's over. No one dared to ask the question. And I think that they were afraid to. That's the only answer I can come up with is, and I know for my parents that holds true, is they were afraid of the answer. They didn't want to know what had.
Yeah.
And if there's one thing I can say, that's not a good enough reason, people. We need to be brave. We need to act. If we see something wrong, okay, maybe you didn't want to say it while the relationship was happening, but afterwards would have been an okay time too. And actually would have made an entirely huge difference in my life. I would have not spent 2 decades thinking that I was unworthy and absolutely incapable of being loved by God. That would have made a huge difference in my life. So ask questions. Don't be afraid of those answers.
Yeah.
Right. And you're 16, 17 years old, and anybody, just like the nurse seemed like the most compassionate person at that time, and she didn't even know you.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
you would think family members would say,
Yeah.
hey, are you doing okay?
Yeah.
How are you doing? Do we need to get you counseling? Of course, I know the church sometimes looks down on counseling. What you went through, the trauma that you experienced had to been
Yeah.
really overwhelming.
Yeah.
And then feel everybody just drops it like it's no big deal.
Yeah. And that is exactly how it felt. It felt like, oh, everyone took a collective sigh of relief. Oh, she's not getting married. It's okay. Let's move on. And there was a lot of relief for me, as much as I was feeling like I failed God. And there was still that huge hook that I don't have to keep moving forward with that in my life. And it was true that nurse, the doctors, actually, the team of doctors that he was under care for when I would call to do checkups. I remember when they invoked the HIPAA rule, he was so careful with me. And the doctor over the phone, if he could have sat with me, I think he would have. But he was like, are you going to be okay? Who do you have in your family? Where can you go? And at this point, I was living on my own. My parents really weren't sure what to do with me because there was this aspect of you were supposed to get married. You're supposed to get out of the house. And so they're like, you need to just figure life out. And my grandfather's house was available at the time. So I moved into that house and I just got a job at an ice cream shop that I could walk to. And so I was living on my own. And he was like, can you go to the library? That's where I go, where I, can find comfort. And he was just offering me all these options and basically saying, I'm caring about you. I'm concerned for you. Just do what you need to do to be safe and be okay. And I still remember, I can still feel what I felt when I was on the phone with him. And those were the moments. It wasn't from my family at that point in time. It wasn't from the church leadership. And I'd even tried to go down to Morningstar a few months after the relationship had ended and to speak with that same leader that had warned me, hey, we're concerned about the age. The reason I was going down and wanted to have a conversation with him is he was head of the prophetic ministry there. And I really wanted to say, hey, what happened? Why did God reveal this? And why was God saying that this is God's will? And now it's changed. So can you help explain this to me? But his answer was he refused to meet with me and said, I told him not to get involved with you. And then he just left it at that. There was no care. There was no, let me take care of you. Let me help you. I know what happened and this was wrong and let me help you. Even if they didn't know about the sexual aspects of everything. Just the abuse, the spiritual abuse, just that abuse of using and manipulating a good chunk of my life, those fundamental years, based on this prophetic word, that in and of itself should have been something that they should have been aware of and willing to take part in taking care of.
Right. And I think the church doesn't really know what to do with victims. And it's sad that we don't, because the Bible says they'll know we are Christians by our love.
Okay.
And just to show that you're concerned about somebody, even if you don't know what to do, to say, hey, I'm concerned about you. What can we do to help? That would have gone a long way
Yeah.
to helping you in your healing journey a lot sooner.
Yeah.
And to validate, okay, you went through something that was horrific, and I think we need to walk you through this. And even if we don't know what to do, let's find out together where we can go to get help
Yeah.
to help you through this trauma.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes churches over spiritualize trauma. If it's a physical thing, you have to go to the doctor.
Yeah.
And we can take you to the hospital and we can take you to the doctor and we can get you fixed up. But if it's a emotional and spiritual, then it's, you just need to pray and ask God to make this all right.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need more than just prayer.
Yeah.
Prayer is important, but sometimes you need people to walk you through this process and answer questions, the confusion that you had, and then nobody still addressed it for years.
Yeah. If I can echo what you said, so many people said, "Oh, I'm praying for you." Well, that's sweet. And I appreciate that. But I needed someone to take action. I needed someone to sit down with me and talk with me and offer to get me some help or to make it safe for me to have a conversation. I would have needed someone in authority to make a safe environment for me to even acknowledge the sexual abuse, right? I would have needed someone to say, hey, this wasn't your fault and you're not responsible. I just need to know if this had happened. I think a lot of, particularly in the church, right? A lot of victims fail to come forward because of that sense of responsibility that they had, whether or not that they had any culpability or not. There is that sense. And I think that we have to destigmatize some of that. And it's okay to have this conversation and heal from this, because I think in churches, we do a really bad job around sexual abuse, particularly because of that stigma.
And I think churches do need child protection policies that if an adult wants to date a child, that is never right. Right? It's never right. In every other profession, if you're a counselor, you don't date people that are coming to you.
Exactly.
So the same thing goes for clergy.
Yes.
Whether it's a youth pastor or a pastor that's single, they don't date the people that are under them. That power dynamic has to be considered. And if it was a school teacher wanting to date a student, that would never be allowed. And we need to use some common sense. Just because it's church does not throw all common sense out the door.
Right.
And it really is so hard to wrap your head around. How could this have gone on so long without more people raising the red flags?
Yeah.
The medical people did because they see it.
Yeah.
They're trained to see it and to report it and all of that.
Yeah.
And
I actually think that might have been what happened. I don't have proof, but because she was able to actually physically see an altercation, I think that there was a report made to Child Protective Services. And I think that's what really ended the relationship, was the threat of accountability. Yeah.
So, Michelle, do you have any other questions for Sarah?
Well, one of the things that you just said, the accountability, because then there would have to be conversations. He would have to answer questions.
Yeah.
And no one questioned him. And even your peers who at the end said, we knew something was wrong, we knew something was going on, the culture didn't allow them to voice their concerns. This is how it is. And it could easily be me next time or tomorrow.
And they'll even say that when they did raise a question, and even visiting youth would be like, well, that's weird. And they were shushed. They were told, you don't understand God's ways. And this is what God's calling. And this is what God's doing. And how dare you question God, right? And I think to myself, like, how awful. I think about them. They were not harmed. I was not the only one harmed in this circumstance, right? There was an entire youth group that witnessed something, one of their peers being pulled out and taken. They were told, shut up about it, right? Yes, you're sensing that this is wrong. What does that do to their spiritual life at that point in time, especially as
Mhm.
young children. Don't touch God's anointed, right? And don't question God. I'm gonna be like, yes, question God.
We need to, I guess, caution people that people in ministry are people
Mm-hmm.
and they are not God and they are not infallible.
Yes.
And you should be able to question them and their motives when it goes against God and against what you see is right and moral and just, then you should be able to question people no matter what their position is. They are God.
Mm-hmm.
And when they put themselves on that pedestal of I'm speaking for God and I'm God's voice to you, then you need to question that because God can speak to each of us individually. My husband's a pastor, but I don't have to go through him and he doesn't tell me what God wants me to do. We definitely have a good relationship and we talk about all kinds of stuff, but he doesn't say, oh, if you don't hear this from God, then you're not listening to God because he doesn't feel like he's God's voice to me
Right.
and I can listen to God my own self and I
Yeah.
can have my own relationship with God.
I do want to commend you for coming forward and telling your story and doing the hard work of
Mhm.
healing for so long by yourself and now facing your abuser and facing justice for your abuser. And I think no matter what happens, your voice has amplified the hope for other people who maybe
Yeah.
have experienced something similar.
Yeah.
It also helps the people who were there, who were manipulated and did not understand grooming and did not understand what happened and how. And I think that's a big part that the church needs to be more aware of and the
Yeah.
signs to look for with grooming, because when people are grooming, they're very manipulative. They have a lot of power. They take complete power. And we have to see those signs. We have
Mhm.
to see that they're in it for personal gain.
Yeah.
Like something may be going on. And it should be okay to ask questions
Yeah.
and to raise red flags and say, this isn't right. Something's not right.
Mm-hmm.
But they create a culture that doesn't allow that
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
at all. They create a culture that they cannot be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's in the church or that's in the home or that's
Right.
wherever, that's what an abuser, that's how they get away with it,
Mm-hmm.
is you don't question them.
Yep.
But I think bringing that awareness out and talking about it
Yeah.
and making others aware that it happens and how it happens, maybe, just maybe, the
Maybe.
next person will raise the red flag and
Yeah.
say something's not right. And I'm
Yeah.
going to stand up for this child. I'm going to
Yeah.
stand up and say something.
That's
That's
what,
our hope.
yeah, that is. And that's what I'm grateful for, like platforms like this. I don't know that 20 years ago, there was conversation being had
Right.
about these
Right.
kinds of things. Right. And I think that this does, maybe certain people won't listen, but my hope is that the majority of people will, and that it starts that conversation, right? It plants that seed of, wait, I'm allowed to ask questions. I can raise a flag. I can say, let's inquire about this a little further. Let's make sure this is safe, right? And I want to go on record and say that I do know, and I remember all of the people that did raise a red flag. And even though you might not have been heard, that matters to me to this day. I can point to a couple of people and be like, wait, they did raise a red flag. That matters. I'm grateful that validates this
Yeah.
experience for me. And someone did see it. Wasn't enough, but yeah, it does help.
And I'm just so glad for the intervention that did stop you from going through
Mhm.
with the actual
Yeah.
marriage ceremony. And it's just
I can
amazing.
imagine
Be.
Yes.
where I'd be.
Yeah.
Right. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on. And I'm sure that we will be hearing more from you. I know I want to schedule a conversation with you and your parents on a podcast coming up very shortly.
Yeah.
Thank you again for sharing with us today. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate you both.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. We hope this episode of Conversations of Hope has been a source of comfort and inspiration.
Remember, you are not alone on this journey of healing.
Visit conversationsofhopepodcast.org for more resources and information.
Please subscribe or follow and share with those who might need this message of hope. Until next time, keep hope alive.